Hello, everybody, and welcome to another amazing Phia Group webinar, the first of 2020. I am your host, Adam Russo, and I am excited to be here today as we embark, if you all notice, our 20th anniversary of Phia. We've been powering plants since the year 2000. It's a pretty cool logo, I think, there. All right, let's keep it moving. What are we going to talk about today? In the largest ever, the highest registration by about, what, 30%, Matt, roughly? 30% highest registration ever. We keep breaking records every single month, it seems. But today's webinar is on a dose of savings addressing drugs. That's why we're talking about drugs. PBMs and the controversies surrounding them. Today, we're really excited. The overview, the future is now. We always have our infamous PGC FAQs with and the ICE Meltdown. That's a combination of two people. The infamous Jed McCormick. Our political update with Brady. Get rid of that. Rico K, specialty drugs, cost containment, bunch of different things. How do we do some cost containment on PBMs? The ever popular exclusion, the importation, the drug rebates, patient assistance programs, and other strategies. The right to try, and last but not least, stop-loss treatment of specialty drugs. Today's speakers. Did you notice someone's missing? No.
Who's gone?
Ron is gone. Now, people wonder, like, oh, how's Ron? You know, guys, it's not a coincidence. You know, Brady's trying to take over. There's a lot of things happening today. You'll notice Brady's got a big smile on his face. You know, it's pretty amazing. I mean, Brady looks good today, all right? Not as good as the photo, but he looks pretty good today. In addition, we brought back Kevin Brady, correct? We brought him back, even though he did a horrible job last month. I mean, we think it's a new year, New Year's resolution. Yeah. Maybe this time he won't read exactly all the commentary from his notes on his slide. He'll try to inject some personality into it. So let's see what happens.
I'll do my best.
With me, as always, is Brainy Bizarro, our Director of LACATA, the Legal Compliance and Regulatory Affairs. Say hello, Brady.
Hello, Brady.
In addition, we brought Kevin Brady back. Say hello, Kevin.
Hello, Kevin.
And last but not least, the amazing, the infamous. Once we bring her on, the numbers skyrocket. Say hello to Jennifer M. McCormick. Say hello, Jennifer.
Hello.
She is our Senior Vice President of our Consulting Division. Now, with that, what motivates us? As you all know, healthcare costs too much. What is our job here at Phia? To make health benefits affordable. How do we do it, and why do we do it? Because hard-working Americans deserve access to high-quality, affordable healthcare, and we make that happen at Phia here, and we've been doing it now for 20 years. Next, as always, any little bit you can give to the thousands of you listening. If everyone gave $1, we have over $1,000. That's right, Beth?
Yeah.
I think it is. We're already past 10,000. We want to get to 10. We want you to do it. Please help us any way you can. There's a website there, ripmedicaldebt.org. Please donate. Whatever you can do would be helpful. As always, please follow us on LinkedIn. Search for the Phia Group. But if you go on LinkedIn, you'll see some stuff on Phia Group no matter what, because we just keep populating things there all the time. How many followers do we have now, Matt?
4,207.
4,207. That is one more than we had yesterday. Great job, Matt. Your job still exists. Next but not least, feel free to download our podcast. Listen on the Apple Podcast or the Google Podcast. We're excited about it. All of our podcasts are available on our webinar on our website as well. Now, the topic, we want you to choose the next topic for our podcast. What are we going to do this next podcast, Brady? What are you thinking?
When?
Yeah, this sometime this week, right?
This week.
Okay, one question and one question only to all of you there. The question is this. Which of today's webinar topics deserves a deeper dive? Number one, drug importation, latest guidance, drug carve-out strategies, stop-loss treatment of specialty drugs, always an interesting topic, executive and legislative proposals, I bet you Brady wants that one, non-ERISA claims against PBMs, I bet you maybe Jed McCormick might like that one. Let's see what you guys vote on. I'm going to let it get to about 50% voting, and we'll see where we go, just to keep this thing moving. Please do not text us what you think is the best option. We want you to actually do the poll. Sorry, Dan Fisher. All right, it looks like stop-loss treatment of specialty drugs is number one. Why? Oh, interesting. A lot of people get pushback from the stop-loss carriers. Well, they had a really bad experience in the fourth quarter. What a surprise that is. Great, we appreciate your feedback there. We will have a podcast on stop-loss treatment of specialty drugs. So thank you for that. Next slide. Want to make sure we get it right into it. The next one is our PACE certification. Folks, 75% of those of you who are PACE certified are now actually engaging with your groups, and those groups are now purchasing PACE, which means more revenue for your TPA, even if you don't want to be certified. I beg you, go on, look at Chapter 1. Just watching the cartoons, the animation of Ron Peck, and all the awesome information will make you want to come back for more. So we're excited about it. Today's special shout-out goes to Ann Gustafson of PHP Proclaim. And this is what Ann told us. All right, now this is where it's gone too far. Who picked her?
I love this.
Who picked her? Matt?
Yeah, I did.
You picked her, even though she said what she said. I'm a big Brainy Bizarro fan. She is the only fan. I think he has the best slides of these presidents. This is, I'm boycotting from now on. I'm done. So, the only person who likes Brady is Ann. Also, is it a coincidence? Brady gets this slide from Ann. Ron isn't here for the first time in 10 years.
What a coincidence.
Right.
Very interesting. Well, Ann, you know what? I hate the Patriots. I also don't like the Colts. So it doesn't matter. I don't like any of these teams. I'm a Browns fan, which means I don't watch the NFL. So we appreciate you listening. You will get a big goodie bag, a bunch of stuff coming your way. We appreciate it. Next, this is our 20th year, February 10th, 2020 will be our 20th year of existence. I know exactly what I was doing on February 10th of 2000, in my pajamas, in the basement of my mother's house, filing LLC paperwork, begging someone to lend me $500 to do so. Yeah, it's pretty awesome how far we've come. But I do know that we are going to have our newsletter, right? I believe that we have a slide on that as well. At 1:30, the newsletter will be posted in your inbox. I wrote a book of Russo has, I don't know, I think I had a couple drinks when I wrote that one, but I meant it all came from my heart, so I'm pretty excited about it. But it is our 20th anniversary. We're really excited. Someone else said there at Brady, there are 3 Brainy Bizarro fans now. For thousands of people listening, there's 3. That's not bad. You know, can we just do a poll on who's the best? Is it Brady or Ron? Who do we get rid of? Okay, next news. Folks, guess what? I've been talking about it all last year, and we did it. Any employee who's been on our plan for 5 years will have their contribution requirement waived. What does that mean? It's free. Free health care for not only them, but for their spouse, their dependents, their kids, their adopted kids, whatever, their stepkids. It doesn't matter. If it's in their family, they're a dependent, it's free. And how do we do that? Here's how we do it, folks. Because we have cost containment initiatives here at Phia. We have incentives here at Phia. We have built a culture where healthcare is no different than anything else. We look at it from an economic standpoint. We are consumers of healthcare. We have mandatory enrollment meetings. We talk about not just how to enroll, not just how the plan works, not just about what's covered, what's excluded. We talk about the biggest cost drivers for our plan in general, trends that we're seeing in Massachusetts as well as our country. We look at all the most innovative, the best, the newest cost containment programs out there. We use quality data, cost data at the fingertips. Every employee has it on their app. They can see the best quality facilities, the best quality surgeons, the best at the lowest cost. All that information is there. And by doing that, we're able to contain plan costs, which allows us to offer free health care for those employees. Now, I think that's enough for me to talk about right now. Now watch the numbers, everybody. You see the number there right now, right? The minute I turn it over to Jen, these numbers are going to pop. Jen, let's talk to you. PGC's most frequently asked questions. Go, Jen.
All right, pressure is on. All right, everyone. So there's only a couple of questions we're going to bring up this month before we turn it over to Kevin to tell us what happened on the ice meltdown. So to get started, this ties in pretty nicely to our PACE certification. We were talking about that process and getting people to be engaged, understand. There's lots of questions that people are starting to address that maybe they never contemplated before, that maybe means that there might need to be a modification to the document. So question number 1, if a plan provides for 2 levels of appeal, do the claim regulations require that each level be granted a 180-day window from denial to which to appeal? The answer is the regulations are not specifically clear or unclear in this regard. What we do know, however, is that a full and fair review is required, and a full and fair review is defined as issuing an adverse benefit determination, which allows for at least 180 days to appeal. That's right. So make sure that everyone at this point is checking your plans to make sure that for the initial adverse benefit determination, that there is at least 180 days to which have the person appeal the denial. So we know in addition to that, there must be the opportunity for the plan to have some sort of reasonableness procedures that are in place as far as what the notification modifications are. So great, we're all set for level 1 if there's one level of appeal, but what happens if there's actually 2 levels of appeal? And remember that if you offered 180 days for the first level and 180 days for the second level, yikes. From a timing perspective, that not only could get you in trouble with any sort of network situations that would arise, but maybe stop loss as well. So is it really reasonable to have or require that second 180-day time frame? Well, we dug deep, and we found that support the position that offering a 60-day window for that second level appeal is totally reasonable and acceptable. And if you're looking for a specific reference, you can look to the Xerox case, which said that the first denial was actually considered the adverse benefit determination, and anything subsequent to that first level appeal that was not actually considered a adverse benefit determination, but instead it was just the continuation of an ongoing initial adverse benefit determination. So if you have questions or concerns about the appeals process, you're using PACE, you might need to look at your plan document, please reach out to us and we are here to help with that. Question number 2. All right, can't get enough talking about this, I guess. How can we protect the plan against charges incurred in connection with a paid surrogacy arrangement? So I know this is not a brand new topic, but it is an important thing to remember, especially when you need to distinguish between the different opportunities or concerns or situations that it could arise when it involves the plan and having to deal with a surrogacy situation. Situation number 1 is when the surrogate is not a plan participant. This could be a circumstance when there is a family and they are engaging the services of a surrogate in order to have that surrogate who is not a plan participant, not a plan member, not an employee, and not a dependent to carry the child. You should be very easily able to draft some language that specifically says that non-plan participant members are not allowed to receive the benefit of claims under this plan. That can be something that can be clearly established with the plan language, making sure that you are not, as a plan, paying non-participant expenses. In addition to creating a MIWA consequence, that's actually going to be a potential fiduciary issue. The second one is a little bit muddier. What happens if the actual surrogate is a plan participant? Maybe an employee, maybe it's a dependent spouse, maybe it's a dependent child. In those circumstances, there's a little bit more of a complex analysis and a case-by-case considerations that must be reviewed. First, and most importantly, is the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. We need to make sure that we're reviewing the situation to see, is this the spouse? Is this the employee? Is this a dependent child? Are there different consequences and requirements or obligations for who the individual is that's acting as a surrogate? We need to also make sure that we are in line with what it is that the ACA preventive care requirements mandate. For example, under the preventive care regulations, we know that there are certain pregnancy-related charges that are required to be covered. So at the bare minimum, the plan needs to make sure that they are in compliance with those preventive care requirements. So when you're putting together an exclusion, if this is something that the plan is looking to caveat, you're going to have to be very careful that you're doing so in a way that's not going to violate ACA. The other consideration here is that maybe it's a surprise, maybe it's not, but we're very involved when it comes to subrogation, recovery, overpayment type of situations. And you're able to actually use that language within the plan to negotiate and consider this to be a recoupment opportunity, because there is oftentimes a situation with a surrogacy arrangement when somebody is actually getting paid or compensated medical expenses for the care that is being provided for the delivery of this child. So in those circumstances, if there is a particular arrangement that would allow for payment, reimbursement of medical expenses, the plan, if they have good subrogation recovery language, should be able to point to that section of the plan and use this as a potential opportunity to investigate the refund or reimbursement of claims. That is a mouthful. I know that was a lot, but it's important stuff that we consider here, especially since it's a fresh new year. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin to get us started about this ICE Meltdown issue.
Yeah, so for this month's ICE Meltdown, we are looking into what happens to an employer's group health plan if they are acquired by another entity. So basically what happened, one of our clients came to us and said, hey, one of our groups is considering a potential M&A transaction. How is this going to affect their benefit plans? So I don't know about everyone else in the room. I'm more of an M&M guy than an M&A guy, but anyway, yeah. So anyway, basically the legal form of the transaction is going to be very relevant when we consider the impact on employee benefit plans and employees. So at a high level, there are pretty much three types. It'll be the asset sale, stock sale, merger, and the fundamental difference between like an asset sale versus a stock sale or merger is rather than purchasing selected assets in an asset sale, in a stock sale or merger, you're actually purchasing an ownership interest in that country or, acquiring it altogether. So the big difference really at the end of the day is that in an asset sale, really the employees are, for the most part, going to be considered terminated and then rehired by the buyer. It also follows that the buyer is not going to have any automatic rights to benefit plans. And then if you consider it from a stock and merger perspective, actually the buyer is buying that, basically acquiring the company. They're getting their ownership interest, so they're assuming the responsibility for the employees, the liabilities, the benefit plans, everything. So moving on to some of the considerations. So one of the big ones is COBRA. So it can be kind of confusing who should be responsible for what under COBRA. So the IRS actually issued special rules all the way back in 2001, if you can believe it. They identified a special class of qualified beneficiaries, and they have a very original title. They're called mergers and acquisitions qualified beneficiaries. And those individuals would include people that were already on COBRA, and then individuals who also would have experienced a qualifying event from the transaction. So what's relevant is that in an asset sale, typically the seller will be responsible for offering COBRA. However, if the employer or if the seller doesn't do business anymore, they're out of business, then are those people just out of luck? No, if the seller's not in business, they're not offering a group health plan, and the buyer is continuing the business operation in accordance with those assets, and there's no substantial changes to the members, then they're actually considered the successor employer, and that buyer now is responsible for continuing coverage for all of those individuals. It is also important to note that the parties can allocate responsibility through a purchase agreement. So if one entity, thinks that they shouldn't be responsible for this, they can always agree one way or the other. Moving on to another consideration, MIWA. So in the event of a stock purchase, it's not always 100% of the time going to be one company completely taking over another one. So it could be, if it's not 100% ownership, then there's going to be two entities at the end of the day. And if there are two entities, and they both offer benefits under one plan, then that could cause issues if they're not part of a control group as defined by the IRS. And that would create a MIWA, which would create state law concerns and additional compliance considerations. Moving on, there's also special FSA rules in connection with mergers and acquisitions. Essentially, these rules are just going to determine who's responsible for reimbursements under a cafeteria plan. And what's relevant is if the buyer is going to be responsible for those reimbursements, it's going to cover reimbursements that occur over the entire plan year. So that would go back even predating the transaction. A couple other ones, just very quickly, there might need to be plan changes, and that could implicate notice requirements. You want to be worried. You want to think about HIPAA. ACA grandfathered status could be affected, the employer mandate. And at the end of the day, most of this stuff should get caught in a purchase agreement, but in the event that it doesn't, you want to be aware of all the considerations before letting it ruin your transaction. So
super simple.
Super simple, nothing complicated about it. So turn it over to Brady.
That was a lot of stuff there.
Let's throw it all.
From the simple to the, I think, more exciting. So for the political update this time, there's a lot going on. I'm not sure if you guys are noticing in the news that there's just a lot right now, and it's affecting everything, healthcare related when it comes to prescription drugs and talking about different bills that were proposed, different executive actions. Everything right now is being interrupted by currently the Senate impeachment trial, which is actually happening right now, and I'm missing it. So, this webinar is worth more than my attention to that. But also, we had Democratic debate last week. There's 3 more coming up in February. Everyone's talking about prescription drugs. We have a State of the Union address, which is coming up on the day after the Iowa caucuses, where I expect the president will lay out his plan or his continuation of his plans for controlling drug costs. So all those things are getting in the way. But I wanted to focus on a couple things that have happened recently, because I think this is going to paint the picture for where we're going to go in 2020 as it relates to drug pricing reform, if it ever actually happens. So the Democratic candidates for president got on stage last week and talked about healthcare. Not surprising, right? What they didn't talk about, though, much was Medicare for all. We actually got quite a lot from them on drug pricing and what they would do. And I want to point out a few things that were notable, one of which is that all the candidates on the stage agreed that Medicare should be able to negotiate drug prices. This is something that the president ran on back in 2015 and in 2016. His administration has supported this idea. It found its way into a House bill that Speaker Pelosi introduced last fall, and unfortunately that bill is not being taken up by the Senate. So, and that's going to be a problem going forward because without the Senate support, it's not going to become a law. But I think it's important to note that all the candidates on the stage support Medicare negotiating drug rates. Republicans, some of them at least, support it as well. I think we'll see more of that discussion come up again throughout the course of this year. But in particular, two of the candidates on the stage, who are very high profile and both senators, by the way, had a couple ideas I think are worth exploring. And what they've done is they're pretty much saying we don't need Congress to take action on drug prices. So Senator Warren and Senator Klobuchar are saying that they can use their executive authority, if they were elected president, of course, to issue regulations and executive orders, effectively, that would require manufacturers to lower their prices or else face negative consequences. So, for example, Warren's pledge is that on day one, she would actually have the federal government manufacture generic versions of certain drugs. So these are drugs for which is already a generic available, but for what she describes as clever tactics used by the PBMs and drug manufacturers, there's not enough of these drugs being manufactured or purchased, and people still are purchasing the more expensive versions of them. So her plan would allow the government itself to manufacture competitor drugs and would just actually ignore the licensing problems and the patents that these drug manufacturers have. That's a big deal if that would actually happen. Senator Klobuchar's plan is to expand the use of drug importation, which you might recognize that the administration is also in favor of. So the takeaway from this debate is that you had some ideas floated by the candidates that have been supported by the Republicans in Congress, at least some of them, that have been supported by the president. And what's frustrating for me as an analyst in this field seeing is that there's agreement on what should be done, right? Bipartisan agreement, and yet things aren't moving. And that's pretty annoying, but I do think that there's going to be a continued push of this because the voters, when you poll them, especially with respect to the details of what matters to them in healthcare, drug pricing is number one almost every time, that and surprise billing. So I expect that we'll see a lot more movement on that issue. A quick update here on the Obamacare case because there's some breaking news just this morning about what has happened. But as you'll recall, this was a case that started in Texas back in 2018 where effectively a number of Republican-led attorneys general got together and argued that because the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 zeroed out the ACA's individual mandate, the mandate was no longer constitutional. And thus, they said, because the mandate was no longer constitutional, the entire Affordable Care Act should be abolished. That was the question presented to a Texas federal court. That court agreed. That case got appealed by the defendants in the case, who were Democrat state attorneys general and the House of Representatives, by the way, appealed to the Fifth Circuit, which we waited all last year for them to discuss this case, and they had oral arguments in June. There were 3 people on the panel, 2 were appointed by Republicans, 1 by a Democrat. They came out with their decision late last year and basically decided, yes, we agree with the lower court that the mandate is unconstitutional, but they refused to say whether or not the rest of the law should fall or any part of it should fall. They punted it back down, or they remanded it back down to the lower court for reconsideration. In the meantime, though, Democrats asked the Supreme Court to take the case now on an expedited basis. They wanted a resolution on this case. And Republicans, even though they want the ACA, or they say they want the ACA to be repealed and replaced, they asked the Supreme Court not to weigh in until after the election. And so they basically imputed a political consideration or motive to the Supreme Court, which is not typically what it's supposed to do. But it is very common for the Supreme Court when there is a circuit split or a very important national issue involved to take a case, and it would take 5 justices to decide to expedite a case. Well, just this morning, the Supreme Court issued its decision, in fact, that it will not take up this case until after the election. So it's not on a, quote, fast track. Instead, it's been put on a regular track. So it could come up in the next term, which starts in October of 2020, but we will not have a decision on the ACA before the election. And that's important because I think this basically gives the Republicans cover and the administration cover. They don't have to worry about the Supreme Court coming out and striking down all of Obamacare right now. If they did that, then they'd be expected to have a backup plan. And as we know, the Republicans don't have a viable backup plan. We went through a couple of years of them trying to get one passed. It didn't work. So basically, it's given the administration some cover, and it's probably not as good for Democrats, who, by the way, won a majority in the House by running on the issue of health care. So that's the latest on the
what to do
Obamacare.
in
the meantime, well, we're back. Here we are back in this stasis mode. What's possible, again, is that the lower court in Texas might come back out and say, look, we're going to uphold our original decision and say that the ACA should fall. But for now, nothing is going to change. So in terms of complying with the ACA and with your reporting requirements, disclosure requirements, notice requirements, keep everything the same.
So this is not an excuse to say that I can add a pre-existing condition limitation to my plan.
Correct. None of that's changing. And unfortunately, it's a bit annoying because we're back in the stasis mode here. I want to bring up a case that we came across our desk, and I know it's been floating around the industry. It's relevant to PBMs and to the drug industry in a sort of interesting way. And basically, and we're going to cover this either in a podcast or maybe even in its own webinar, because it's really a pretty crazy case in terms of the scheme that was going on here committed by Cigna. So we have a case here involving one of the largest insurance companies in the country, one of the top 5, who is basically embroiled in this scheme to defraud providers, to defraud self-funded plans and participants. What they effectively did here, it involves out-of-network claims. So what Cigna did is it charged the plan a full bill charge from an out-of-network provider. So a provider submits a bill that's out-of-network to the plan. Cigna, as the claims processor in this ASO arrangement, tells the plan, as an example, you owe $50,000 for this bill. That's how much we negotiate with the provider. That's what's owed. Then they take the money from the plan's account, but they don't pay the provider. Instead, they go back to the provider and they try to negotiate in secret with the provider to a lesser amount. So an example given in this complaint that was filed on New Year's Eve, by the way, the provider would be paid, say, $15,000. Cigna would keep that $35,000 extra and deposit it into its own bank account. This is what the allegations are. And that would be the source of the fraud. The plan thinks that the out-of-network provider's usual and customary rate was $50,000, when in fact, Cigna went back behind the scenes and negotiated with the provider and used a lot of strong-arm tactics, is what's in the complaint, to get them to pay a lot less. This is actually an example of the kind of trickery we've seen in a slew of these claims processing fraud cases. A lot of them involve drug pricing as well. It's really insane. I urge anyone who has access to the complaint, it's 150 pages, but the first 5 pages lay out sort of 4 parts of the scheme, including some RICO allegations where they were using the mail system and wire transfers to move money around. They pretty much accomplished this fraud, though.
It's scary stuff.
Very scary stuff. It really is. When we went and looked at the complaint, and there's actually an exhibit in the complaint of the EOBs that were used, and that was really the way they committed the fraud. And just as a brief example of what would go on. So they'd submit to the provider an EOB and to the member a separate EOB. The provider's EOB would show that the plan didn't cover the majority of the bill. So, say on a $50,000 bill, the EOB to the provider would say the plan did not pay $48,000. That's what the patient owes. That's what the provider sees. Then Cigna would issue another EOB to the member, and the member would see that the plan paid $48,000 of the $50,000, that they only owe $2,000. And what's really going on here is that they're telling the patient that there was a discount that Cigna secured with this provider, when in fact that's not true at all. What that amount represents, that they say the plan paid, is an amount that Cigna debited from the plan's account and was keeping. And then after the fact, went behind the scenes with the provider and said, hey, this patient owes $48,000. They're not going to pay you. Let's negotiate a deal. And they'd negotiate a deal and then keep the balance. It's really insane. It's brazen. I think how it was detected in this case, and this is some of the takeaways, is that it was through an audit. And I'm not even sure how the audit was accomplished, because remember, in this ASO arrangement, the audit rights belong to Cigna. So somehow the 2 EOBs made their way to the plan sponsor, who then looked at them and said, hey, something's not right here, and blew the whistle. And now this case is going to become, I think, a class action, because nationwide, according to the complaint, Cigna has estimated to have billed its plans, its self-funded plans, $72 million, reflecting the UNC amount for out-of-network providers. But they only actually paid those providers $17 million. So that's $55 million that allegedly Cigna has, in effect, stolen from self-funded plans. That's a huge deal if these allegations prove true. But why they're important for the drug pricing discussion is that these implications involve non-ERISA claims. So the claims in this case RICO is one of them that we often see. We see state law claims sometimes being brought. This is not a case where Cigna is being sued as a fiduciary. And in the context of PBMs, we're also seeing cases where PBMs are not being alleged to have committed fiduciary breach, which is hard to prove and no court has really proven so far. Instead, they're saying the plaintiffs are arguing against PBMs that they're engaging in antitrust behavior. They're violating the Sherman Act. They're violating the RICO Act, and that they're moving money around in violation of in federal law. They're suing them under state law. And I think what we're going to see in terms of the trend for 2020 and beyond is that because PBMs are allegedly failing, they are failing in many cases to secure discounts for their plans, and as a result, we're seeing out-of-control drug costs, you're going to see these non-ERISA-based lawsuits proceed against PBMs, and that's going to be a game changer as we move forward.
All right. Let's switch over to our topic of the day, talking about trends. You know how much I love trends. So let's talk about specialty drugs. Let's get into this a little bit deeper and actually see the impact and have a better understanding. So question number one is, what is specialty drugs? This is actually a question that we get pretty often, and the reason that people want to know a specific definition of specialty drugs is because they want to address it in their documents. They want to have an understanding. And unfortunately, there is not a specific, clear-cut, easy-to-provide definition of specialty drugs. In fact, the definition of what's considered to be a specialty drug actually varies in the industry from one PBM to the next. So in general, the definition that we can come up with is that a specialty drug is something that typically is a high-cost drug that has some sort of safe or special handling instructions like refrigeration required or it's an injection. So we know that the amount that this is supposed to account for is 50% of the total U.S. drug spend in 2020. That is a significant amount of the total expected cost, considering only 1 to 2% of Americans are actually using them. These numbers are pretty startling when it comes to what we need to pay attention to towards the beginning of the year, and if there are ways that we can potentially try and control or pivot or transition or mitigate the costs that are going to be falling to the employers and to the patients and employees themselves, because this is something that is pretty scary and startling. We know also that in 2018, for example, there were 59 new medications that were actually approved by the FDA. And of those 59 medications, 39 of them were considered to be specialty. So if we know that there's not a clear definition of what's specialty, but it seems like year over year, the more drugs that are coming to the market are being considered specialty drugs, that's potentially eye-opening for what we can expect to see in 2020 and 2021. So we actually need to be on the lookout for what it is that the impact is going to be. And there's a stat on here from 2015 about what the average cost would have been annually for somebody that was using a specialty drug. And even more startling than this one, I was able to find a study from 2017, and it established that the cost this year in 2017 for the average treatment for someone receiving a specialty drug was actually $79,000 was the average cost of a treatment, versus in 2017, the average median wage for a household was $60,000. This is getting worse. The disparity here is much higher in 2017 than it was in 2015, and we can only expect this trend to grow and the distance and the gap between these two numbers to get even bigger. So we know also that the average cost for the average for 61 specialty drugs in 2017 was at $78,000, and looking at those exact same drugs in that exact same pool in 2006, the price for Medicare Part D was $27,000. If these numbers, and I know that everyone thinks that I excel at math, this is a scary, eye-opening event. We have to pay attention to these trends so we can see if there's something that we can do to mitigate it. Let's get into some more specifics. I can't say that word apparently today, especially this word I cannot say. So some of these new drugs here, we wanted to make sure we could point these out as things that you are paying attention to, not that you can specifically exclude them from the plan, but you can be aware of the cost and the potential options. There was a study that I was actually able to find that noted that 20 highest costing drugs in the United States in 2019. And using that list, looking through the various ones costing between $65,000 to $135,000 to $2.1 million. These are some really expensive drugs that we need to make sure that we are on the lookout for. And one of the things that is preventing this from having a generic or preventing this from being something that is going to be perpetuated, there are programs that are becoming to go into place. We're going to talk about this in a little bit about these patient assistance programs. The thing that's concerning here is a lot of these drugs, these newer drugs, becoming more expensive, coming to the market, maybe the patients aren't as worried about this because they're realizing that as soon as there's a new drug and a new higher cost, there is actually going to be a patient assistance program that's being associated with this drug. So maybe from the employee's perspective, this isn't necessarily as scary as it is for the plan, who is the one that's going to be caught actually having to cover the cost of these, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. The other thing that we should be paying attention to 2020 are some of these programs that we're starting to see pop up that different companies are discussing and presenting as another option for the insurer and even for the actual patients, where we realize, acknowledge, and understand that there are some really high-cost drugs and something has to be done. So the solution has been, let's put together an installment plan. Let's put together similar to our loans that we might have, our loan forgiveness program that you can pay over time, and then that way it's going to be a little bit easier for the plan to swallow over the patient to swallow. So thinking about this, that sounds great, but what is one of the concerns that you would initially have if you are a plan sponsor and thinking about a pay over time, paying over 5 years, paying even over 2 years? Well, are you going to have a stop-loss policy that is going to allow you to put this in place and consider you to reimburse the plan? Is the plan going to exist in 5 years? There's a lot of underlying conditions and considerations when you're looking to have a plan or a patient adopt one of these programs. But let's talk about a little bit more. So they're not specific only to some of these high-cost drugs. These are also things that individuals are using if they can't otherwise afford their prescription. So, for example, I've seen this put into place where someone can buy a monthly subscription so they can get insulin treatment for $99 a month. That's all they have to worry about is just having and paying the subscription, and they get their prescriptions. Maybe this type of program, maybe paying over time or getting a subscription for a particular drug is what we're going to see. Maybe that's going to be a new trend for 2020 when people are trying to launch these programs, these new drugs. And the name of the drug that is $2.1 million, I can't say it.
It's Zolgensma. I was waiting for you to say that, Janet. That's the name of the drug. And many of our clients have people who are on that drug. The most expensive drug I think that's been approved so far, although I think an Alzheimer's drug could be coming out soon that is even more expensive.
And for that drug, there actually is a pay over time program where an insurer can or a plan can have the option to pay for that drug over the course of 5 years, knowing that it is so super expensive. So I would expect that we can see more of these programs, more of these different types of methodologies, payment strategies put into place, because there needs to be something done. And I think that these are only going to be Band-Aid approaches, but to ignore that they exist or pretend like they're not there is going to be short-sighted for what we need to do for the future.
One thing I just wanted to add quickly is that we had someone ask a question about FDA fast-tracking and the impact that would have on stop-loss. Great question, and this year, or maybe it was last year, I think the FDA has really hit a record number of drug approvals. They're doing it at a faster and faster pace. So, yeah, there are concerns. I'm not sure we know yet exactly how stop-loss is handling these fast-track approvals. You could probably assume, and I think we would assume, that they're probably not covering these drugs. If they're not approved in the traditional way, I expect you probably see language that's developed that would limit coverage for those drugs. But, yeah, absolutely a concern that we're aware of and that we're seeing more of in the industry.
So what to do about it? I have some ideas. Let's talk about them. Okay, so one of the things that commonly we have started to see, especially now knowing how startling, how scary, how big, how unbelievable the threat potentially can be to plans because of the cost and the frequency at which we're starting to see these new drugs developed and push to the market. And I don't want to take away from the fact that these drugs can be life-altering and life-changing and life-saving, but we need to make sure that we're balancing that with the benefit of being self-funded and realizing that there are certain things we need to contemplate outside of that, and aggressive billing may not be something that we can tolerate as a self-funded plan. So option number one, completely excluding specialty drugs from the plan. Is that something we've seen? Sure. Is that something that is a little bit more drastic or aggressive? Sure. And in putting together a provision or exclusion for that, there are a lot of underlying considerations, such as whether or not this is going to futurely create a situation for someone who is receiving a drug to no longer receive that drug. Maybe this is something where by eliminating this tier of coverage, there is a network issue that is problematic. Maybe there is a situation where this is being done and this could alleviate the plan from being non-grandfathered, and now they have to be non-grandfathers and they have to make other changes to the plan. Maybe while ACA still exists, that is going to change the impact about whether or not it's going to meet the requirements for being minimum value plan and considered to be appropriate for the employer mandate. There are a lot of considerations to review before actually just putting an exclusion in the plan to remove that from the plan. We also know that there are certain requirements for preventive drugs. So in order to have an exclusion in place, make sure that the plan is still otherwise covering those preventive drugs that are required, making sure that we are not targeting a particular condition or a particular disease. So if we are going to put an exclusion in place, making sure that we aren't targeting X situation or X condition or X disease. Instead, we're having a category, a classification for the entire treatment of the disease. And as always, when you're putting these changes into place, just making sure that you're doing it in appropriate time frames, that you are following the rules under ERISA of giving the advance notice, whether you're modifying or reducing the coverage that would be available to the participants. And then in addition to the timing, making sure that any other documentation that relates to the plan is changed as well, because the last thing that you want to do is create a conflict between the plan document and the FBC, for example. All right.
Wow. Yeah, that's
a lot.
There's a lot there. And there's a couple other strategies that we've been asked about repeatedly with respect to controlling or trying to control drug costs. And this one probably comes up the most, I would say. Sorry, Jenna, my slide's a little bit more important here when it comes to importation, but drug importation. So, again, I mentioned it a little bit in the political update that it's an issue that the Democratic candidates talked about, the president's talked about. He talked about it in his blueprint that he released for lowering drug prices, I think back in 2018. I actually heard recently, too, I think it was actually today on Twitter, that he was upset with his own administration for not doing more on drug pricing. But one of the biggest things being discussed right now is importing drugs, in particular from Canada. So, of course, the first question we always get is it legal? Is it safe? Which are two different questions, actually. And on a legal question, look, it's a complicated answer. The short answer I'll give you is that no, it is not legal to do. It comes down to a matter of enforcement discretion. And when we ask the question, is it legal, we have to ask, what are we talking about? We're talking about legal for individuals to import drugs, for companies to import drugs, because that matters. On the FDA's own website, it talks about the limited instances where a person can import drugs if they meet certain criteria. And I won't read through all of them, but generally speaking, it has to be for a serious condition where effective treatment is not available in the U.S. You must only import a small quantity of said drug, no more than 3 months supply. You can't obviously sell it to someone else. But there's very, very, very little in terms of the categories that would apply to you to be able to import your own drugs personally. For companies, it's not legal to do this. But the history and the reality shows that it's very rare. In fact, almost never has the FDA actually cracked down against companies. There's been a few instances, I think, of a few storefronts in Florida that were raided by the FDA, but really no serious action. And it's kind of how the federal government has treated marijuana laws, and the fact that marijuana is legal in many states, even though it's still federally illegal. It comes down to selective enforcement. So the landscape changed a bit, though, in February 2019 when the FDA issued their warning letter to a large vendor in Canada, which administers a popular drug importation program. The letter effectively warned them to stop this practice, noting that they have violated numerous provisions of federal law, including introducing unapproved new drugs into the stream of commerce. And this vendor responded back in a letter where it defended its actions and defended itself, saying, look, we're not a brick and mortar pharmacy. We aren't actually, doing the things that you allege that we do. And I think now they've rebranded under a new name, and we've seen them creep up in various emails that I've seen involving our industry and more broadly. But it still goes on. And I think the latest now is that where it appeared a crackdown might be coming because of this warning letter, the administration, which is in charge, of course, of the FDA, released its own plan and proposal back in June for allowing the import of drugs. So to me, that can signal one of two things. Either the administration is not going to crack down on entities, including plans and states and companies that import drugs, or it could mean that it is going to crack down. And the reason I say that is because the administration is proposing its own plan, which has two pathways for importing drugs. If they take the position that you've got to use one of these two pathways and you're not using those pathways, they might be intending to crack down on vendors and other entities which are engaging in the importation of drugs in a different way. We don't know exactly what they'll do, but I think it's worth discussing the little bit more detail about the plan the administration has for its pathways. So the first pathway would involve the government approving particular programs to engage in importation. So they would allow states, they would allow wholesalers to import drugs, but notably here, I'm looking at the plan, and I don't see that drugs will be allowed to be imported by plan sponsors or by entities. It talks about states and drug wholesalers and manufacturers. So I think what the administration is thinking here is that they allow the states sort of as laboratories of democracy to figure out the best ways to do this. That would be great. And in this pathway, certain drugs would qualify only, and conveniently perhaps for some, not high expensive drugs, including insulin and Humira. For some reason, those have been exempted. I wonder why. The second pathway would let the drug makers themselves import their own products sold in other countries. And presumably what that would do is it allow them to sell those products at a much cheaper rate. So two different pathways, neither of them explicitly say that plans or plan sponsors or insurance companies can import drugs. So that's notable. So you might have to, if this proposal actually passed, and by the way, that's the key here, it's just a proposal. We're right now waiting in the notice and comment period. This could take a year, 2 or 3 years to actually become an actual regulation that gets finalized after the notice and comment process. But it is a big deal that the administration is taking this seriously. They've released the proposed rule. We're going to get feedback across the board, but I had some takeaways I wanted to underline here and just remind everyone of. Don't get so excited that this is going to be the easy fix to the problem, because there are going to be a number of drugs that can't be imported even under the administration's plan. I mentioned a few already, and I think if the lobbyists have their way, that list will get very long. The other thing, too, I mentioned already, who can't import drugs? Pay attention to people who are not listed in these pathways. Self-funded plans are not. Other entities are not. Just states, wholesalers, and manufacturers. The timeliness of importation. This could take years. Be aware of that. Also know that Canada is pushing back on this. The Canadian market for drugs is much smaller than the U.S. market, and there's been this fear, I think in the media, it's actually in Canada being described as a bit irrational, but that we could be taking all their drugs and they would have a supply problem. So I think the takeaway there is to expect some pushback, or we should expect some pushback as a government from Canada, so that this may actually never go anywhere if the Canadian government has some kind of restrictions that it imposes in response to this. So there's a long way to go here. The short answer is that our position is that it's not legal to import drugs. That's not changing. It comes down to enforcement and whether or not we think the federal government will actually enforce it. It's also worth noting that there are some provider liability laws to consider here. That the concern is if you're importing drugs from other countries and the drug has some kind of issue with it, which causes a patient who takes it to become ill, to have some kind of adverse side effect, that the liability laws in other countries, we just don't know what they are. And in some countries, they may not be very good. And so the recourse for a plan participant to sue a provider or pharmacy who's selling a drug overseas may be limited. That's a very big concern as well. So there's the latest guidance. I expect in the first quarter, I think the notice and comment period is running out soon for this proposal. We'll see what parties submit their notices and comments, and if that reveals more about what we expect to see with drug importation programs. But we want to spend some time talking about briefly here patient assistance programs. We had some questions that were received before the webinar about these programs, and I think it's worth just going over why they're so popular and sort of what the concern is with them. So it's true that these programs, I think Jen mentioned this in another slide, that these do a lot of good for patients, that they do provide access to expensive treatment. All that's good news. But we're here to talk about what is in the interest of self-funded plans. And the broader implication is that this will, in the end, benefit patients as well if their self-funded plans, stay alive and stay afloat and don't go bankrupt. So here's the problem. More than 300 drugs, and that number is probably higher now, are associated with these programs. And manufacturers spend about $4 billion per year on them. Someone remarked, and I think in a question, that these programs alone account for some of the largest charitable giving examples in the country. That's not by mistake, right? These are great public relations benefits to having these companies issue these assistance programs. And like I said, they do a lot of good. The problem, though, is that they can increase the demand for specialty drugs even when generics are available. And that's what may be going on here if you're a cynic, like I've become from all these political updates. As an example here, you might have a specialty drug that costs $10,000, and a generic's available that has a list price of $2,000. The health plan involved here imposes a $500 copay for specialty drugs when a patient chooses a generic anyway, right? That's pretty standard. And they would assess a $100 copay for a generic. But in this particular instance, the drug manufacturer is offering the patient a $450 copay card if they use a specialty drug. So when you factor in this copay card, it effectively reduces the out-of-pocket cost for the member right down to $50. It's cheaper now than if they bought the generic in terms of the out-of-pocket cost. Manufacturers know this. They know what they're doing here. And they're steering people. Again, I'm not saying they're all cynical and doing this for bad reasons, but that's the result here, is that the patient is being driven to pick the higher cost option because of the use of these copay cards, which is reducing, their actual financial liability in the end. And at the end of the day, when we hear about, the stats from Kaiser, about 29% of Americans are skipping treatment and not taking their prescription drugs because they can't afford it. It's because the money is what matters here. And if you're going to tell patients that you can save money by picking a more expensive option, why wouldn't they do that every single time? So that's why what's happened over time, and there's a lot of articles about this, about whether these are good or bad in the long run. I think that on the whole, these programs are actually driving up costs. I think there's no two ways around that. It's uncomfortable to sort of admit that, given how much good they can do, but that's what the data out there says. Jen, over to you.
All right, so just to add on to that a little bit, when it comes to the coupons or the assistance programs, in order to actually be eligible for these different types of programs, there are certain types of criteria or requirements that must be met. This isn't something that is readily available to everyone, but the idea of this is very attractive. Personally, this was something that I was able to experience and see firsthand the impact that this was going to have for me, for my expenses, and for my plan. And one of the things that I found most interesting about this is that the eligibility can vary from drug to drug, from company to company. But most often, the underlying requirement that we always see is that the individual has private insurance, non-governmental private insurance. And most often, these types of programs, whether it's copay assistance or patient assistance, is only available for those individuals that have some sort of underlying net that is going to be able to pay the rest of the actual charge or the claim once the individual's obligation has been met. Is that problematic? I'll let you decide for yourself. The other thing that is considering a little bit of attention here, or something that we should discuss, is the fact that we talked about this in the past, but there is the guidance that said that there is a non-enforcement for 2020 until they figure out exactly what it is that is going to be the impact for whether or not these types of assistance, copay, patient assistance, whatever the actual assistance is going to be in the form of, whether or not that's going to count towards the out-of-pocket maximum. And we know right now there is a non-enforcement of that provision, so the assistance does not have to count towards the out-of-pocket maximum. But how would a plan, how would an employer, how would the administrator actually know whether or not the individual is actually receiving that assistance unless the individual tells them? I, for example, if it was me, wouldn't necessarily go and let my administrator, my employer know that, hey, I have a copay of $150 here and I'm actually receiving $125 a month in assistance for it. Make sure that you count that towards my out-of-pocket, or you don't count that towards my out-of-pocket. Those are conversations, aren't things that are actually readily happening with the employers. So before putting these different types of programs in place or modifying the language, you really need to consider how it's going to be administered so you're not creating any sort of disparities or inconsistencies in the processing. The other thing to consider here when this comes into place is actually taking a look at the assistance program. So you can actually find these online if there is maybe the opportunity for somebody to apply. I Googled a couple of them just the other day to see what these requirements were. And the thing that they're bragging about on here is that, yes, they're not available for uninsured, but they're saving billions of dollars over the years. This is a marketing point. This is a PR that makes these companies look good. Oh, this is so attractive. Look, they're all for the people, when we really know that the underlying issue here is potentially how they can get the individual to choose this drug over the generic drug because they can get to the plan faster. Next, there's some other strategies we can briefly talk about before we get over to talking about the right to try, which is something that's important to discuss. Maybe we're carving out high-cost drugs. Maybe we have a plan that has a tier for generics and then a second tier for brand, but we completely eliminate specialty. Or maybe there's some in-network and out-of-network programs. Maybe we use a particular vendor to help us reduce some of the costs, or we encourage some of these programs that we feel would be more appropriate. Maybe we're looking for a strategy where maybe we encourage you to talk to your human resources department about what options for drugs would be the most appropriate for you. Maybe we use the resources or the data or the analytics that we have to help use that information to promote an individual to still voluntarily seek an effective drug that maybe has a lower cost not only to the plan but to the individual. Maybe we incentivize them by rewarding them financially by making those choices. Maybe we add these different types of tiers, or maybe this is all grouped in together with a health or wellness program that we offer as an employer. And last but not least is pharmacogenomics. And this is something that has become pretty important and talked about over the past couple of years. So we have realized now that there is a way scientifically to figure out whether or not a drug is going to have the biggest and largest impact on an individual based on their particular genetic makeup. And this can be pretty scary when it comes to concerns about people having your DNA, having access to that, and whether or not this is going to initiate any sort of concerns over GINA. But while the research is still brand new, this is something that is proving to be effective as long as we are cost-effective and effective individually for the treatments. It is expensive, but maybe using this sort of science and using this sort of technology is going to eliminate step 1 and step 2 that could have otherwise been more expensive treatments and get to the treatment that's going to work faster and sooner. So that way we're alleviating costs, alleviating time, and making people well faster. I think we have yet to see the actual impact this is going to have on plans. It is still pretty rare for us to see a document that specifically address gene tests or genetic testing because there are so many concerns and unknowns since this is so brand new. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Brady.
Right, Jen. Can you imagine if a gene test could tell you ahead of time that Zolgensma would not be effective, right? You could save $2.1 million. So I think the future is definitely in pharmacogenomics. It's also in the right to try legislation. Don't forget this bill that was passed back in May 2018, which you covered before, but I wanted to bring up again because there are some parts of the bill that I think could form the basis for some cost containment considerations. Briefly here, that the bill does, it allows individuals to receive experimental drugs which have only passed phase 1 clinical trials, are not fully FDA approved. It does not require insurance plans to cover these drugs, but it gives access to patients if the manufacturer agrees to these drugs. And as a result of that, why you might want to cover these drugs if you're a plan is because we've heard of cases, and there are cases where people actually who are using experimental drugs to heal faster. The amount of time they spend inpatient, for example, is limited because of these kinds of drugs. If you want to cover them, talk to your stop-loss carrier. Be careful in doing so because there are considerations there if you want to cover them. But this leads right into this last point here about stop-loss. We get tons of examples, it seems like on a weekly basis, of people running into problems with their stop-loss carrier, dealing with specialty drugs. And we're going to have a whole podcast now, thanks to you listeners, on this topic. We'll go more in depth. But just know here, I've listed here the most common pitfalls you run into. E&I exclusions, where you have what the drug was approved for may be slightly different, and the carrier will say, hey, well, you use it for an off-label use, we're not going to cover it. Carriers also focus heavily on the frequency of treatment, say, okay, yeah, this drug is not E&I, it is not experimental, it is necessary, but you, provider, administered that drug 10,000 times. You gave too many back pain injections, and we're going to cut you off. We had a medical review done as a stop-loss carrier, which is our right under our contract, and we think you ignored this part of the definition of medical necessity. So basically what we're saying is review or have us review your stop-loss policy, look at those definitions, see if they include important terms like frequency of treatment or timing of treatment, or even where the treatment has to occur, because we're seeing more detailed definitions. If you can get a policy that has an endorsement where the language is adopted from the plan, even though that's not a slam dunk, it does significantly reduce the chance of a gap in this case, and have your own medical review done if you think necessary, right? Have that ready to go if in the case the provider or the carrier questions and has their own review done. Don't assume your PBM is handling everything else. Make sure that you're very involved, especially where you have very expensive treatments involved, as you often do with these kinds of drugs. And with that, I think we've come to the end of the webinar. We're going to have absolutely a podcast on stop-loss issues as it relates to these issues. We'll talk more in depth about some of the other things. But on behalf of myself, Jen McCormick, Adam Russo, and Kevin Brady, thanks for tuning in. We'll talk to you guys on February 12th for our next webinar. See you then. Thank you.